We're here for the third installment of our discussion of Adam Curtis's new docuseries, Can't Get You Out of My Head. This time, we're just going to be talking about a single episode. We've been doing 2 episodes at a time up until now with the last 2 episodes. This takes us up to episode 5, the Lordly ones. We're just going to be talking about the Lordly ones today because episode 6 is basically a feature-length documentary in its own right. About 2 hours long, which is a little weird because every time I've seen any kind of review or description of this series, they say it's like 6 hours and a little bit when it's very obviously 7 hours. I don't know why reviewers can't do math. Me and Matt were actually talking about some of the reviews before we started recording and the various reception that this has gotten, which is not very much. Maybe we'll talk about that a little more as the conversation goes on or at the end. I'm not sure. But anyway, so to start off our discussion about the Lordly Ones, episode 5, this episode, Curtis talks about nationalism, about fascism, about ethno-nationalist movements, the Ba'ath Party, religious extremism, and then even at the end, sort of the more milder, more Western forms that we have in the form of the Trump movement and Brexit, that he sort of sees as echoing some of these same sentiments. And it's really, this episode is among all the other threads an exploration of where that comes from. And so I guess I'll kick it over to Matt.
So my opening thoughts related to this episode actually relate to what they talk about at the very beginning, which is the Opium Wars. I was very interested in the fact that Adam Curtis started with talking about that because, so as you say, the episode's kind of about nationalism coming up and in the United States and Britain, a lot of despair and people trying to revitalize a sense of, I guess, communal understanding and wanting to perpetuate the idea of their own exceptionalism. The episode begins with talking about how Britain or the United Kingdom crippled China by getting so many people by forcing opium on the Chinese people, getting so many people addicted to opium and destroying countless lives. And then what was also interesting about that was the sense of shame among a lot of the British when they realized what had happened. So there was a sense of shame, of course, related to the slave trade, but then became a sense of shame related to the Opium Wars. Oh my God, we've ruined lives by getting Chinese people addicted to opium. But then it's like, I was thinking about that from a psychological standpoint because it began with shame, but shame is a hard emotion to tolerate. So it becomes you project your shame onto another group of people or another person and say it's all you, it's not me. I'm innocent. I'm a good person. I haven't done anything wrong. You're the enemy. You're the menace. You're the pest. And so the shame the British felt about the crimes they committed against China became a fear of a xenophobia directed at Chinese people, which was felt also in America.
The interesting relationship there between guilt and fear, just to linger on that for a second, maybe before we move on. What I find fascinating about it is you can kind of see the underlying logic there, that if initially you feel guilty about something that your nation has done in the past, and then you begin to think, okay, well, we did that. So that means in principle, they're capable of doing it to us and they're going to want revenge. And in a way, it's kind of justified that it should happen to us. And so the wheels begin to turn when you have that guilt or that shame. And it almost naturally transforms into fear. And you can kind of see how that fear and guilt, they're both sort of two sides of the same coin. They're almost two different responses to the realization of an immoral past to your own empire. right? So you could argue, so some people will say this is very vulgar and like an unfair characterization of modern left and right, but I'm going to say it anyway. You could say that in a lot of ways, the symptoms exhibited on the modern left are very guilt-based, of very much recognizing the past crimes of, for example, the United States government against the Native Americans, against the African Americans, and so on and so forth. And then you could say that the exceptionalism on the right comes with the sense of fear as well. You could say that in some sense they're both coming from the same place, but your response to it is sort of going to be dependent on maybe your underlying temperament or maybe your underlying intuitions of whether or not you think it's a good thing anyway that the empire was created. And for a long time, a lot of the British did think it was a good thing because they were, quote unquote, civilizing the world, and what have you. But I thought that was very fascinating of just the parallel with Chinese society, because then in the, I guess, going into the 1990s at that point, the Chinese were quite feeling we had a century of humiliation. We're not going to let that happen to ourselves again. And I guess it was interesting. I thought maybe I'll bring this up before I can kick it over to you if you had any observations on the guilt and fear connection or anything else besides that. But just how really when they bring in the concept of people looking for that national story, it starts with sort of the question of what could China believe in now that they got rid of communism and democracy. And that was Deng Xiaoping's solution, was find that other, that foreign threat that you can latch on to tell that story. And as Curtis points out, that doesn't mean it's not true. There's like a nugget of truth to all of these. But he harnessed that same power as well of fear of the West, basically to basically make China what it is today. Which many people would say was quite it's reached quite a horrific state of affairs there. But we can maybe elaborate on that more as we go on.
I think I've kind of realized this, or I've known this for a while now. But the documentary is kind of giving me more details and kind of shaping the argument a bit more clearly. When people on the left generally, they talk about, say, how imperialism, we're still feeling the effects of imperialism today, or in the United States, people might say that we're still feeling the effects of slavery today. And I'm not trying to I'm not bringing that up. I'm not bringing those things up to make a political point necessarily, but I'm saying it is kind of striking to me that the world that we understand, the world that we live in today, it does partly derive from, say, the imperialism of the United Kingdom. Now, we can have, if we want to start having we're not going to do that for this particular episode, but you can have a conversation or a debate about, well, what were the benefits or the of the British Empire? What were the downsides and the flaws and the crimes they did? And we're not really going to get into that today, I don't think. But well, maybe we will to some extent. But I think that it still is an important point to make. It's kind of like, that's why I brought up the slave argument in the in the context of the United States. It's like because many people say if you're in certain left wing circles, you start making arguments in favor of reparation, and then that's not a very popular political position in the United States. But you don't necessarily have to be in favor of reparations to say, well, we're still feeling the effects of slavery and segregation today, even if we got rid of slavery and segregation.
Right. Well, and I think it would be hard to question that, like, materially, we are dealing with a material distribution in the here and now that was caused by just expropriating people's labor and resources in the past. And so even though it's not just like one-to-one, like, oh, all the stuff you have is from oppression and all the reasons why I'm poor is because you stole it from me. It's obviously not that simple, and everyone knows it, but everyone also should know, or it should be common knowledge, at least in my opinion, that, yeah, the reason why we have a disequitable distribution of wealth along racial lines in the U.S. is because of historical causes. It's not just like people's free will in the here and now, like choosing not to work as hard as they could or whatever arguments like that, which I think are really kind of pernicious when you break them down, like the really moralistic view of politics. But I think on a deeper level, what Curtis is talking about too, it's not just the physical material conditions that we have now that are determined from the past, but it's like our mental framework and our ideas that are inherited, like that same fear and guilt about the quote yellow peril at the turn of the century. I mean, Jesus, look at us today. I mean, like the last several presidential administrations, who is the big geopolitical boogeyman? It's China. Before that, and this is kind of funny to laugh about now, but you can go back and look at a lot of a brief period in the 1990s when Japan was very much feared as like, oh, they're going to economically overtake us. And there's a number of funny kind of cultural artifacts from that period. There's a movie called Rising Sun, which is a sort of buddy cop drama with Sean Connery and I think Wesley Snipes, I want to say, where the Japanese are the enemy. There's also Die Hard, original Die Hard.
A Christmas movie.
Right. But it's Nakatomi Plaza. The big company is a Japanese company. And there's a line where Nakatomi says something like, hey, we couldn't get you at Pearl Harbor, so we thought we would get you with electronics instead. It's very unsubtle. There's another movie called Black Rain that was like samurai where the evil people. Anyway, not important. The concept of an Asian nation being an economic threat that's like emerging to the Western powers, and then this leading to a sort of fear surrounding them as a group is not new, but it's still happening to this very day to some extent. And I guess that's one of the interesting aspects of what Curtis is talking about.
Well, this might be a good conversation, and I hope I'm not, or this might be a good part in the conversation to talk a little more about China, and I hope I'm not jumping too far ahead. If I am, let me know. But so later on in the documentary, Adam Curtis talks about how the way that China decided to secure its future, the way that China decided to make sure it stays afloat, was by investing heavily in the United States and buying up a lot of
buying up the U.S. debt. Yeah, which kept the U.S. dollar strong.
Buying up the U.S. debt.
And so even though we were going into all this debt, it didn't affect the value of the dollar. In fact, the value of the dollar is going up, making the Chinese goods even more.
Exactly. I found that very, very interesting because, I mean, at one level, it's like that's almost like the real world conspiracy, I guess, if you will. Like if you're truly looking for if you're truly looking to make China the enemy, it's like, well, that would be the real world bit of information you would use to lure people to lure people into your.
That's true. But if I could interject, I mean, I think what's compelling about the way he presents it, though, is that the way Curtis presents it, I feel like I'm more or less convinced that we would do the same thing if we were in their position.
Oh, yes.
I
wasn't making a moral judgment necessarily.
Right.
Saying, like, if I were a conspiracy theorist trying to say China's trying to take over the world, I would point to that.
Right.
As my justification for...
Or at least trying to knock off the U.S. At least they're trying to knock us down from our number one spot. Well, because, it's like our debt that they're buying up that they now hold. And, all of our revenue flowing into their coffers, sort of. So it's a brilliant, I mean, it's a great argument against international capitalism. If you're like one of the people who talks, see a lot of people talk a big game about being very worried by Chinese human rights violations and the Uyghur genocide and things of that nature. So if you care about that, but you're also a big capitalist, it's like, well, look, within international capitalism, this was a judo move that they did. I mean, not trying to say judo. That's actually Japanese art, but it's a perfect analogy because judo is all about exploiting the way getting sort of underneath your opponent and using their weight against them. That's exactly what this was. They saw the vulnerability and the way the U.S. is doing business in the market and saw this is how we can take control so they can't do what they did to us before,
Well, it's funny because it's I'm almost reminded of this analogy kind of came to mind, like how people say Vladimir Putin kind of like keeps like going back and forth from various positions, but he's people say, oh, he's the one who's always in charge the whole time. He's just, stepping down occasionally because of certain regulations and rules in the Russian government. But it's so basically it's like the idea that the best place at some level, or if you want to be first place, you want to be second place, because like China's like at some level like willing to be second place right now, like to keep the U.S. first place, but secretly they're basically first place, or at least they're becoming more and more first place. They're just kind of they are the wizard behind the curtain.
Right. Well, and I think
it's they're keeping the illusion. Not to say the U.S. isn't still very powerful, but they're keeping the illusion that the U.S. really is the most dominant force on the planet.
Well, it creates a mutual.
It might not always be that way, and it might not really even be that way as much anymore.
Well, it creates like a mutual economic interdependence as well. So if you're a country like China, where you might have been, I don't think they're worried about this now, but in past decades, worried about the U.S. as like a military threat, all of a sudden it becomes very hard. I mean, we may have even brought this up last time, but when all of your, 80% of your pharmaceuticals are made in China, and then all sorts of electronics goods and all sorts of other goods, it becomes very hard to justify going to war with them. And you would certainly have those supply issues if you did go to war with them, if you didn't first find some alternate means of dealing with that. But I think more importantly, I think you're right that is what they're doing. I think a lot of the undertone now of the anxiety in the economy, I would say, I think there is an undertone to it that we all kind of know China is not going to be able to keep pumping these cheap goods into the Western economy forever, because people will talk about China's declining birth rate or how they're hitting a demographic cliff. But what does happen if that happens? I mean, that's not just bad for China. I mean, if we've basically been keeping the economy afloat, not going into hyperinflation because we have this constant influx of cheap goods, that's actually not good for us either if that all collapses.
The perils of the interdependence of kind of global capitalism, which is because it's not really quite anymore the scenario of like we're just going to invade you, like a bigger country invading a smaller country, stealing all the resources, and maybe letting the small country keep some, maybe to sustain themselves, but only enough just to sustain themselves. Now it's a matter of like, we're all kind of, or the elites, if you will, are kind of pulling the strings in such a way as to, all these countries are dependent on each other, which I guess in the short term you could say has helped the standard of living go up, help the overall global economy. But then if that system collapses, that means the whole world is going to go into. I'm very ignorant of economics, but I could imagine if the current financial and economic system collapsed, it would just be felt all around the world, and maybe in a way that it might not have been before.
We don't even have to make such a grand prediction because it's very hard to say such a thing. I mean, I'm probably in the same opinion as you, but I would say it's even maybe on a more basic level, just looking at the facts that we already have, like on the ground. Nations don't invade each other with tanks and planes anymore. But what China was doing, again, you were saying to take the more like anti-China view, you could call that like economic warfare or a form of it. And then, I mean, and that's not to excuse the US, because if we use that definition, we can find many, many cases of economic warfare by the U.S. I mean, we use the United Nations and NATO to impose economic sanctions on a lot of countries, which, people like the reporter John Pilger have called a medieval siege, that you basically strangle the society of trade. Often it makes it very difficult to get in medical supplies, even in countries that we have really stringent sanctions on, like Venezuela. We were sanctioning them very stringently last year or the year before. I think it was last year. Same with Iran. They're constantly getting hit with sanctions. We hit Iraq. We did economic sanctions in Iraq more or less continuously between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. And I mean, it just made it impoverished the country. It wages war on the people, more or less. And I think that's part of the goal, right? With policies like that is, well, the people will become so dissatisfied, it'll destabilize the country and they'll revolt. So it is a regime change policy. But in practice, what usually ends up happening is the party officials and the military pilfer what little food gets in, and they still live fairly comfortably while everyone else lives in horrible poverty. And they usually end up knowing who's doing it, which is the United States and the Western powers, and they end up resenting them more than their own people or their own leaders, for example. So, you know, the average person in Iran probably doesn't like the mullahs very much, but he knows that it's the United States and Britain that have constantly, imposed these sanctions on their country, that tried to overthrow their government several times. And so in spite of all the horrific economic damage of the sanctions, especially when they were being sanctioned on getting medical supplies during coronavirus, it doesn't actually lead to them overthrowing their own people. Although I guess the topic that this episode does cover, I believe he says over the CIA's history, they tried to overthrow 66 foreign governments, and in 26 cases they succeeded. So that's a perfect example. It's like we're very, how would you put it? We're endurance overthrowers. Well, we may not succeed every time, but we'll try again.
I guess to add a caveat to what I said earlier, I'm not necessarily trying to make grandiose claims. I mean, the thing that another thread in this documentary is that I was sensing is basically people are the same in every time period, and we kind of go through the same struggles, just with different people and different technological levels and other different political influences and whatnot. But it's interesting to me. One, kind of trite fact of modern history is the idea that after the decline of the British Empire, that the U.S. kind of took its place. And again, it took its place in a way which was not the same. The U.S. imperialism, if I may speak of it in such terms, is not the same as we've been saying. The imperialism of the British Empire. But what I think is kind of unspoken, the unspoken truth of the situation is it's very possible that we will end up like the British Empire. I mean, the old saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, people literally thought like the British rose to power because and conquered most of the. Were they the largest and most powerful empire in history? I think. I don't know if they were, but they were.
It depends on how you define it. I mean, the largest landmass was Genghis Khan, but the British, like naval power, like the amount of power they could project over the ocean, like it's kind of hard to say they owned all those seas, but no navy could challenge the British Empire. And I would agree too that it's like the Anglosphere, right? So we're a different polity, but we're still very firmly part of the Anglosphere. And exactly. It's not just European too. Like Anglo is important because Britain and the United States fought against Germany in World War I and World War II, and it could have gone the other way, where it could have been a Saxon sphere, so to speak, where Germany might have been the ascendant power of Europe. But I think there is more of an argument for the U.S. it's like a continuity almost of the style of empire in a way, or a new innovation or development on it, because the British also styled themselves as bringing democracy and bringing civilization to all these peoples. And that's more or less what we tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, was nation build and hope they would turn into Jeffersonian democracies.
Well, and I guess I bring that up because of what you just said. I mean, it's very possible that the U.S. will not be, and this is kind of a topic we've kind of touched on maybe fairly frequently in this series, but the U.S.'s kind of position in the world is not going to be for eternity. I mean, again, I know that sounds like a silly statement. Nothing's for eternity. I get that. But, I mean, what was it? I saw some Obama speech a while back where he was like, yeah, no, like I want to make sure the U.S., is the strongest country, militarily, economically, technologically. We're going to make sure we're on top. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And I mean, that's the illusion of almost every great power in history. It's hard to know what it would look like if the U.S. weren't, as powerful as it currently is. What the global kind of chessboard would look like.
Yeah,
But
well,
I think it's inevitable. I think it's inevitable, and I think our elected leaders, both in the Democrat and Republican Party, they're living on the assumption that no, we're just going to be in power globally forever, and nothing's going to change because we know what's right, and we're going to spread American values all across the world, and we're going to live happily ever after.
Well, and I think there's an understanding that the same people that more or less bankroll the two parties in our country, like maybe I think you're right that we U.S. is not going to last forever, but I think the
U.S.'s
financial
position in the kind of
right. No, yeah, I got you. You're not saying we're going to collapse and all die.
No, yeah. I'm not
but
saying
the
that.
world will be, like Spain used to be a great power too. They're still here, but now it's a place where people go on vacation and throw tomatoes at each other and run away from bulls. So yeah, no, I the U.S. will eventually just be a tourist destination where people from the Ascendant Empire, like let's say Turkey, come to ride horses and shoot guns and stuff like that. So anyway, I gotcha. I guess what I'm saying though is that I think what you could maybe say is maybe the most, what would you call it? Like scaremongering claim in the documentary, but it's a fear I share. But it's sort of maybe the most radical claim that this global financial sector is sort of positioning itself to like almost detach from all those nation states to the point where, those empires might rise and fall, but like the banks that fund everything and bankroll all the political parties in all of these countries, these will go on forever. And how it's like they've set up this system. We talked about this last time, the technocratic system, how it basically tries to keep everything in the status quo forever. And I think you're right that it's an illusion definitely in the national level, and that politicians think they're going to continue to hold this power. But it is kind of scary when you look at the technological control that's there from like the tech giants and the financial sector and what they're able to do, and how, I mean, and how the sad thing is, it's like, it seems like the biggest threat that comes to counter that are these like right-wing, often racist movements. And that the left wing seems to, I mean, one of Curtis's big critiques that maybe has been a thread he doesn't talk about so much in this episode, but except in the one part where he talks about comparing the Vietnam War to the Iraq War, how there were not as many protests. The economic damage wasn't as bad because there wasn't that Chinese money there during the Vietnam War. Now there is, so the economy could stay afloat. And how a lot of just these well-meaning liberals, it seems like, to extrapolate from what he's saying, they didn't do all that protesting, and they didn't have as much of a revolutionary spirit because now maybe they might not want things to change as much. They've kind of gotten rolled into the institutional system. They've kind of become conservative in their own way.
Culture became mainstream culture, and now the counterculture, quote unquote, is kind of the people that are trying to go back to
the pre-democratic radicalism, and that's what scares a lot of people like me, because we shouldn't have any illusions that those people wouldn't create a horror show if they gained power again, just like fascists in the past did. On the other hand, we also shouldn't have the illusion that this current apparently beneficent technocratic system is that it is benign or harmless, or that it isn't also the cause of so many of these very real problems. And it's almost like you were kind of saying in the first episode we did, Matt, that it's like, it seems like he's sort of lamenting, like, where are the left-wing radicals? Oh, well, they're lost in this dream world. The right-wing dream, on the other hand, seems to be a lot more like actionable in the real world, so to speak. I don't know. I'm kind of just rambling at this point.
No. I don't think you're rambling at all. And actually, to further what you're saying, to go back to something else Adam Curtis touches on a lot, the destabilization of the Middle East. The funny thing to me, I guess, maybe one of the historical ironies, of course, the technocratic this technocratic institutionalism that's being created and solidified. It was more than willing to use Islamic terrorism to fight its to increase its power at whatever human cost, and but then it's a little more complicated than that, because nowadays it's not just Islamic terrorists on the side of unintentionally on the side of these technocrats. Now you're having Islamic terrorist groups kind of spring up, these reactionary Islamic terrorist groups spring up, which are they might have been created or funded by the CIA or by the United States or whatever, but now they're beginning to fight against those same technocratic elites. And I'm not saying that therefore that means that there's some liberation theology we should be supporting. But it just goes back to what you said about the action of how certain right-wing ideals or certain right-wing belief systems are more, you can put them into action in the real world more. I mean, for whatever reason, for good or ill, it does seem to me that there's a
right. Well, I think
the slight conservative or reactionary strand in Islam, whether it was originally, whether it gained its influence, or it kind of gained its influence, I think, through Western interventionism. But then now it's the tables are turned, and that same reactionary Islamism is kind of fighting against those Western powers to just creating a weird dynamic going on.
You can find footage of liberal people from France, and I think very religious, revolutionary minded people from America going over to Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s and talking about how the Mujahideen are freedom fighters for the cause of liberty against the Russians. And so when that cause of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan was aligned against the Soviet Empire, the liberals and our conservatives were able to say, it was, I think, in another Adam Curtis documentary, actually, where I saw footage of a lady saying she'd gone over to fight with the Mujahideen and said they love their God, and I think it's the same God as ours. This is like a right wing, Reaganite, and you think about the kinds of things where they basically say Muhammad is like Satan. A lot of Christian evangelicals nowadays, which I'm sure there were people who said that then too. In any case, they played with fire. The other big case nowadays and in the past couple administrations was Syria, with Hillary Clinton and various others saying we have to fund these jihadist groups in order to overthrow Assad. And in the case of Libya, taking out Gaddafi, again, that served our interests, quote unquote. But now the result is not liberalism. The result is there are slave markets in Libya for the first time in hundreds of years, being run by Islamists. And so that's a rather horrific outcome to that. And as to why it's more actionable, I've kind of thought a lot about this, and I guess it's because the people that they're always talking about, or that Curtis is always kind of highlighting these past couple episodes, who are really left behind by global financial systems, are the rural people, the country people, the people who are a little bit more self-sufficient because they don't have as much of a communal infrastructure that you have in a large city. They tend to, in America at least, they're going to have guns, or they're going to have to be able to protect themselves. And they're the ones who are suffering the most from the deindustrialization. Whereas liberalism is always it's always the ideology of more educated people. And that has its upsides and downsides. And one of the downsides is liberalism, as it goes on, tends to get incorporated into the institutions rather than, produce the same kind of like communist anarchist destabilization that America saw, say, like turn of the last century. That doesn't really happen anymore. Instead, around the turn of this century, there's way more fear about armed right-wing militias in America, just to use that as the example. And so the same thing in Iraq. And I guess, that's what they did when they went to the sheikhs and said the sheikhs should rule Iraq and not the progressive people of the city, which I found that bit very interesting. I didn't realize how, like some of the footage they show of like Ottoman era Iraq, that I guess was colorized. It does look like like it could be a Western European city, if not for like the skin color of the people there, where they're just like playing Parcheesi in the park or whatever, and wearing like suits, and they're, working these professional jobs. But instead, both the British and the United States turned to the sheikhs and the desert tribes to take power. And so Curtis argues that's because of a prejudice they had about the simple rural folk. But I think part of it also is the realization that it's easier to motivate like Islamic radicals and desert tribes and self-sufficient people to sort of militarize, if that makes sense.
Well, and Adam Curtis, to talk a little bit more about this thing, the I guess Islamic terror. Not trying to harp too much on this. But Adam Curtis seems to suggest that the creation of ISIS, which the West is responsible for, at least in large part, it's a new kind of threat, or it's a new kind of organization, of like terrorist organization or political organization, because as you say, these old kind of these, I guess, ghosts of the past, as Adam Curtis might say, that this kind of old, this conservative or reactionary way of thinking that has, well, it's in kind of lurks under the surface of many countries across the world, Western and non-Western. But in terms of the Middle East, those ghosts of the past that were in these Middle Eastern countries are resurrected on top of, modern like military tactics and just a kind of a modern way of viewing politics.
Well, and they can broadcast their executions. I was going to say, on the technological front, they can like broadcast their executions to the whole world as well.
Exactly. So it's a weird like mix of modern and, what would you say? I guess maybe medieval, or just older.
Yeah, medieval.
Kind of ideas. And of course, I often wonder if something like that could happen on a large scale, or if something like that could happen in so-called West, or in like what is seen as these stable Western democracies.
Right. Well, it would probably take the same form, which is why the technocrats are always freaked out about the right-wing reactionaries. Most likely, because if there was going to be some sort of revolution, the militias out in the hills who could maneuver and do guerrilla warfare and all that kind of thing, they're all going to be right-wingers, or they're going to be religiously motivated. That's like, religion also has that quality of getting people to, that's something that gets people to sacrifice themselves and think beyond just their individual existence and their individual values. That's why there's always a reactionary element as well, is because it often comes with religion. And so religion can get, that's a very powerful motivating force for a jihadist, but that's inherently kind of regressive and based on like tradition and what this book says, and not what anything new, is out there.
To a parallel in like a non-Islamic religion would be Catholicism. I would say Catholicism has been a pretty conservative, again, some might even say reactionary kind of force in the Western world. Now, it doesn't have as much power as it did, obviously. But that's just another example. It's not necessarily just Islam that has this reactionary, this reactionary power.
There's that. So I guess to talk about something maybe compositional about the documentary, because we haven't talked as much about that since our first review, but the way that this one more or less ends, I really love the composition of, where he basically points out, okay, we looked to the desert tribes as the more authentic version of Iraq when America went in. The British had made the same mistake. And then the result was that these people, as you say, it's these medieval ideas with modern technology, but also all these people, the public faces the jihadists, but then all the people behind them are the people who served in Saddam's army and who worked with the U.S. in this tribal uprising. And so they know how to fight in the country. They're an experienced army, and they swept across the country. But then, so he shows then ISIS's own promotional footage, which is very disturbing and violent. I mean, you don't actually see too much of the executions, but whole motorcades of people in cages, presumably going to be executed. And they're playing the song from Cecil Sharp's, I think it was Cecil Sharp who wrote The Immortal Hour. I might be mixing up the name, but, the British pastoral sort of idyllic play that captured the British imagination with the song The Lordly Ones, sort of the idealized version of the down-to-earth natural being living beyond the democratic modern society. Not modernity. It's like, these are the lordly ones. These are the people who live under the natural hierarchy out in the country. And he plays that song from that as we're seeing these jihadists roll through, and that has been the inevitable consequence of that prejudice. And then it transitions to the KKK, which was another similar thing based on a mythic past. And so that would be another example, just to bring in the composition of that whole end of it, of that choice of music, and then switching from the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria to the Klan, which was another sort of creation of an imagined past of this like perfect natural hierarchy before democracy, and sort of unifying those three ideas. But that's another example.
Such a surreal.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
It's such a surreal like situation of like the fiction unintentionally or maybe intentionally creating
intentionally in the Klan's case.
Fiction becoming reality through just how much of an influence those stories had, especially in the context of like the what we know of as like the whites, the white garments and head coverings that like KKK members wear. That was the creation that came from that movie. With the name of it, I forget.
It's a Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation. That's it.
Yeah, infamous film now.
The KKK members didn't wear those until that movie, but now that's what we know about the KKK at this point, or that's one of the most iconic images of the KKK.
Right. Well, and he even points out that that it was based on a novel that was about kind of inspired by Scottish clans, but that Walter Scott had made up a lot of that. And so it's like the further you look, you find like fiction and more myth, and you get to the end, the beginning. It's like, oh, this has always been here. This even in the mythic past, there is the idea of the time when you imagine there was this perfect society. They were still dreaming that there was an earlier society that was more perfect than that.
Well, and the funny thing I find about this like idyllic past, this romanticization of sort of say like a small what would you say, like the small farmer, or like the self-sufficient individual, maybe he lives off the land or things of that nature. I mean, it stems straight from the Romantic tradition. But I find that a lot on the left, actually. I mean, ironically, that this
really, yeah. Could you expand on how?
Well, this I don't want to get too much into say globalization, but I think that's a kind of an example of what I'm talking about. I bring him up too much. I sound like a fanboy at this point, but Christopher Hitchens said someone told him be careful not to idealize Walden Pond because of, or idealize like the pre-industrial idea, because that is ultimately conservatism, and that is a past which really didn't even ever exist. But two, you could not really get back to it if it ever had existed. It goes back to what we talked about before. Of course, the liberal, conservative, these terms kind of are breaking down. I do, but that is a strand of conservatism which I do see in the left, in which I have been susceptible to in the past myself. I mean, my I won't say his name for privacy's sake, but my uncle, he's in environmentalist circles, he's fairly well known. But he kind of has, he's almost, even though my family's committed Democrats and they consider themselves of the left, he is kind of a weird conservative figure because of how much he loves nature and wants to preserve the environment. And that's just an interesting tidbit that.
Yeah, well, I would just say that's interesting because when you first said that, what I was initially thinking was how I see a yearning of Democrats to want to go back to the 90s or even to the 2000s or like the Obama era, 2000s and 2010s, which is not that long ago, but it's like a mild form of conservatism. Like we kind of want to freeze things in place, and we feel like things were kind of good very recently. And now they're getting out of hand. But what you're saying is like even an idealization of the pre-industrial days. And when I think about that, I'm like, yeah, that is kind of true. That like a lot of people blame industrialization for the problems of modernity. But the agrarian society was equally like it was even more unequal in many respects, and people broke their bodies laboring on farms just they did in industry. It had its own set of problems, just as the industrialization did. But I think that's and
that's why. I'm sorry if I may jump in here just really quickly. That's why I think people often get Marx wrong, or they misinterpret what he kind of his project or his worldview. Whether or not you're a Marxist, if you actually look at Marx, he is the one who says like, no, don't romanticize this pre-industrial past. Even though he's the one who's saying we need to get past this past the horrors of industrialization, and past the I guess what was the early stages of capitalism. He was not saying therefore we need to get rid of all this industrialization and get rid of all the influence of capitalism and go back to the pre-capitalist world. He wanted to go beyond. He was trying to be post-capitalist, not pre-capitalist. That was just an aside I wanted to add.
Well, right. Well, and a lot of people tend to leave out these days that Marx seems to almost write at times that this is a series of inevitabilities, that this is like just the movement of history. It's not even really a question of should we revolt. It's that the revolt will happen. It will be a natural development from capital or capitalism becoming, taken to its extremes. As important as it is to point that out, maybe part of why that romanticism grows stronger and stronger on the left as well as on the right, in the present moment is because in this increasingly technocratic society we're living in, I think people have perceived that that's probably not going to happen, and that Marx is probably wrong that this revolution to communism is inevitable. It seems like we're actually being, we talked about it a little bit last time, deeper and deeper into technocratic managerialism, where we just have a series of managers over society trying to manage all of our disparate individual impulses. And that sort of, future is very unpalatable to a lot of people. And so then what they look around and they say, well, what is a story that I find more palatable? And it's like, well, nature. Back when everything was and a lot of people do have an idea of like anarcho-primitivism, or the idea that we had a sort of natural communism before the rise of like agrarian society, even that individual in the family level and tribes and villages is basically a primitive form of communism. I don't know whether that's true or false. I just think the popularity of that idea that I've seen kind of increase in the past number of years may be an indication of what you're talking about, that because this coming technocratic future is so bad, we've kind of talked about everything so far in this episode is sort of the right wing saying, well, fuck, let's go back to this pre-democratic, pre-modern future or past that was closer to nature. There's the left idea of that as well. It's like, oh, no. It wasn't a natural hierarchy. It was natural communism. Everyone has their idea of what the natural paradise was like.
Well, yeah, I mean, and of course, when you look at human history or the development of human history or development of civilization, of course, you kind of people tend to be in either two camps of like the Hobbesian idea of like it was a state of utter chaos and bloodshed and barbarity, or the more Rousseau idea of like, no, people were just self-sufficient and they didn't bother anybody, but they didn't want to be bothered. I mean, we could say that these primitive societies were, lacked, I guess, hierarchies. We understand it and were at some level, I guess, communistic in the most literal sense of the word. But as I was saying earlier, that's we can't get back to that. I mean, that's why I find anarcho-primitivism to be such an absurd ideology, because even if for the sake of argument, I say, okay, anarcho-primitivism is totally right. Everything they say is completely 100% accurate. One, I mean, I don't know. One, it's I don't know how you would get back to that ideal. I mean, and two, it would be an ideal kind of cold-hearted idea in certain communist countries was, well, a lot of people have to die, but then we'll get to communism and it'll be great. That's kind of similar to the anarcho-primitivism idea. Millions of people are going to have to die when industrial civilization supposedly collapses, but that'll be okay because
right. It'll be the happiness of future generations.
After that, the future generations will commune with nature, and again, all the hierarchy will be gone, and it'll be great. So there's a question of like how you're going to get to that ideal practically, but then there's again that question of, well, are we really? I'm stuttering. Are we really willing to sacrifice all those people, all those
millions.
Lives and whatnot?
Well, probably billions, because so we were just reading. Ideal. We were just reading Thomas Paine's Agrarian Justice for Beyond Talking Points, where he talked about universal basic income, which is an argument Paine talks about. But one of the things he mentions is why we can't go back to sustaining ourselves based on hunting game and gathering, because that you simply can't, like the same amount of land that could support 100 humans with agriculture might support 10 or just a handful of people. If you're just using it to hunt game, you need so much more I guess I'm just saying, returning to anarcho-primitivism, no matter how you do it, is going to be a massive population reduction, because the earth just can't support the current population without agriculture done on a massive scale and on an industrial scale. So you're basically saying like, yeah, we need to kill millions so we can return to monkey. My final thought on it would just be that the moment that they talk about when Tony Blair had the historians come to see him, who said, well, let us tell you how Gertrude Bell set up this country with this false idea of, this idyllic pre-modern society out in the countryside. And you created this really unstable society that collapsed. And that's the whole thing that caused Saddam Hussein to take over in the first place. And they actively helped him and gave him a list of communists in the country. The interesting tidbit there too was Terrence Young, the director of a James Bond film, directed a film for Saddam. And so it's things like that where you realize just the level of propaganda. It's so obvious when you see it from the outside, but we would tend to see, the stories that we tell about why the U.S. empire does what it does from the inside, not to be propaganda. But that's just sort of an aside because, of course, as he brings up, the spies were, through the character of James Bond and, in modern times, Jason Bourne sort of mythologized as to this is the face of empire now, as the spy, the intelligence man. But it was those same people, the spies, that came into Tony Blair after the historians and showed him, no, Saddam has all these weapons of mass destruction. We know that. They were the ones who failed us, and so it's just like, it's another example of like, I guess it can be very hard to pin down if you try to tell somebody what an Adam Curtis documentary is about. And you say, well, he talks about how we always live in a dream world and that prevents us from seeing reality. And it's very easy to think like, well, okay, what does that mean really? But that's like another example of like the spy was sort of this make-believe figure, this make-believe world of spying and adventure, and Britain still running the world. And, that being the defender of the monetary system and the global order and of freedom and this, that, and the other. And then that prejudice, what it produced was actually a horrific outcome for Iraq that leads to the rise of ISIS. And so we see how in all of these cases, with just taking the case study of the country of Iraq, we intervened based on these illusions and myths, that these dreams that we had made up, and that it progressively made the situation worse every single time we did it. And the people who said, we should look at the facts here and the material conditions of history, we're told, what was it Tony Blair said? Saddam Hussein is an evil man and he needs to be put away. That same idea that echoed what he said in Kosovo of like, oh, it's just the world West's responsibility to just take down evil dictators. That's what politics is. And you sort of realize like that whole view of politics moralizing, that's its own little illusory dream world where you're not looking at the complicated reality that's a lot more gray and a lot more nuanced. That might allow you to avoid something like letting the Ba'ath Party come to power or ISIS take power, seeing the political realities and grappling with them on the real level. That's not what happened in Iraq. It's, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's not really a critique of the technocrats or the fascists or the communist radicals or anyone. It's a critique of kind of all of us in a way that kind of applies to all of them. It's almost like human nature. It seems like to like when we're unable to really face or comprehend our problems, we create like, and we imagine a new story that makes more sense to us, I guess.
Yeah, well, that I guess to give my final thoughts, that comment by Tony Blair. I mean, it's such a childish comment. It's kind of humorous to me that a senior politician in the British government would put forth such a simplistic argument in favor of a military intervention. And if you're going to, because it's like, I mean, from my perspective, if you're going to invade a country, I mean, I want you to like put forth or, give a very detailed, systematic argument, like for the very specific reasons why that country has to be invaded and what the invasion is going to accomplish and what you expect when you expect to leave and all that stuff. Which is why I'm a Buckley-eyed in waiting. But
embrace your destiny.
Embrace my destiny.
No, fight it, Matt. Fight it. Don't go quiet into that good night.
I mean, it's hard to know what thoughts I should probably leave to the next episode, where we'll kind of maybe give more overarching views of the documentary. But the thing that maybe most struck me near the end was, I think it's almost for one of the I think it's actually the final, the kind of thing that Adam Curtis leaves with us, the creation of Oxycontin, which is just, I mean, it's funny to me at one level because it's like, well, the British forced the opium on the Chinese. And then, here we are, people getting addicted to painkillers in the US and other Western countries. These drugs that, they quite literally say can put you in a dreamlike state.
The final card, is the description of Oxycontin's side effects. She can cause a nod. And he uses like this beautiful electronic like synth soundtrack that just swells like this. It's like the THX logo at the beginning of a film with like a huge sound system almost, where it's like, I got chills watching that, where it's that sense of like, oh, wow. It's like you realize, you see like almost, man, that what we're doing with Oxycontin is exactly like you were saying, Matt. It's that same kind of drugging yourself into this dream state to avoid facing up to the real problem. But I'm sorry I jumped into your...
No, you're fine. But it kind of reminds me of the idea of like masters being the ultimate slaves at some level, because it's like, okay, the British Empire was trying to kind of basically enslave China by getting everyone addicted to opium. And then what happens? We end up having drug addiction problems rampant in Western countries. Today, it's like I mean, I wouldn't put it this way really, but it's almost like the white guilt is causing us to give ourselves an addiction to, pay for our sins. Again, I'm putting it in a ridiculous.
Well, that's like, I think the social media addiction, a lot of people certainly express it that way. And then there's the other side of the people who want to say, no, America's awesome, and I feel no guilt, and they express it through social media too. Anyway, you can find Matthew Kentucky Matthews stuff over at The Anti-Philosopher on YouTube, or on Beyond Talking Points, where he talks about politics beyond the talking points with his co-host ANCAP Matt. And thank you once again, Matt, for coming on. Always good to talk to you. You can find my stuff at Essential Salts. Matt, anything else you want to plug? Anything going on?
But your mic cut off when you said my YouTube channel. So if anyone didn't hear, that was you can find my solo content if you search the Anti-Philosopher on YouTube.
Okay.
Keegan said it, but he was cut off by technical difficulties.
We'll figure it out. Okay. Yeah. Again, I'll edit it together into something that
Zoom
makes
is
sense.
trying to prevent you from finding my YouTube channel because I'm so subversive and brilliant.
Yes. Yeah, that's what it's all conspiracy. All right, y'all, have a good one. We've got one more episode. We'll talk about the final installment of Can't Get You Out of My Head. Have a good one. Peace in the Middle East.